Welcome to Savage Rants. I'm Nick Savage. Here in Canada, all legislation must, after second reading in the House of Commons, proceed to the committee stage. Here, the standing committee, whose area of expertise most closely relates to the subject matter of the bill, calls witnesses and studies the new legislation closely, with members from each official party represented. The committee may then amend the bill, aka change it, and then send it back to the House for third reading. Recently, the Standing Committee of Public Safety and National Security held hearings on Bill C-51, the new controversial terrorism bill introduced by the Harper government. What made the committee's study of Bill C-51 so special was the amount of criticism it received from witnesses, particularly since the government gets to choose a majority of the witnesses in these hearings. The legal hatership ranged from the drafting of the legislation.
The language must be clear. Reasonable opposition, even to the point of demonstration, should not be considered terrorism.
There is, in other words, a mismatch between the government's justifications and the actual text of the law.
Some excesses and slightly overwrought provisions.
I don't see those safeguards in the bill.
Why I was quite shocked that this legislation ever made it here. The Justice Canada lawyers I know would never have said that this was anywhere near constitutional.
The way this law is drafted it's imprecise and it's overbroad.
To its constitutionality.
Amend the bill to remove any reference to the Charter being contravened by CSIS.
So we have no precedent in Canadian law for judges authorizing breaches of the Charter.
This new legislation will further undermine the equality rights of Canadian Muslims and other groups defined and protected under Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
It would never survive a constitutional or charter challenge.
I don't think any security agency in this country should be granted the right to override my constitutional protected right.
From the gentle.
I am here not to destroy the bill. Rather, I want to assist in proposing some practical amendments that will improve it and perhaps save its constitutional legitimacy and integrity.
That we would like to consider Bill C-51 to be a work in progress.
To the not so gentle.
This bill is reckless. The bill is more about posturing ahead of an election than it's about better protecting our public safety.
This bill isn't really about terrorism, less about being anti-terrorism, and more about protecting the status quo.
I worry about what a child whose mother wears niqab will be feeling as he listens to his Prime Minister talk about her in disrespectful language.
To the just plain cryptic.
Bill C-51 is fundamentally flawed. It is a Faustian bargain, a trade with the devil, if you will, where we're trading our rights to gain a false sense of security.
Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
The secrecy in the no-fly list, very problematic, Kafkaesque approach.
In the end, however, a lot of witnesses had the same clear message.
We cannot afford to enact this bill.
Is that it's so flawed that we need a restart.
It is my opinion that the bill should not be enacted.
We're recommending not moving forward with this bill.
So what's a government member to do with all this criticism? Deep reflection? Changes of hearts and minds? Apologies for the terrible legislation? No. This is majority government rule, not rational leadership. So today, boys and girls, we will examine how the governing party deals with constructive criticism of its legislation. These days, regardless of whether you personally agree with the bill or not, the job of a government member is to destroy those who would oppose it. Now, while it would make their lives 100 times easier if they could just call these fairly expert witnesses who disagree with them a bunch of lying turd munchers, those words, including the actual words lying and liar, are not considered parliamentary language. The reason for this being that the truth, at least pointedly put, makes wasps nervous. However, members of Parliament have found a way to adapt to this environment in a couple of peculiar, yet rather sad ways. The first is simply to find another word for lies.
And I find it extremely unfortunate that there's been such misinformation put out about this bill. I just wanted to correct some of the misconceptions that I've heard so far in this committee. So I just wanted to clear those two things up on that I've heard so far as misconceptions of the bill.
And I believe that there's a lot of misinformation being offered.
Misconception, misinformation.
Misconceptions, misunderstandings. The word lie by any other name still smells like shit coming from professional liars. Another trick is to claim your opponent is uninformed. Despite having been called to testify on the bill you are discussing, your job as government MP is to assume, out loud, that they probably haven't actually read it. Since if they had read it, they wouldn't be critical of it. Get it?
If you actually read the bill on page 3, the fact of the matter is that you look clearly at the bill. We've had at least 2 witnesses come in here, and perhaps they didn't fully read the bill or maybe did not fully understand it. If you actually read the bill.
When alleging incompetency or fibbing doesn't work, one way to deal with criticism is to treat a critical witness like a child. You take on the tone of a teacher in a primary school class, and you speak to the witness as if they, despite being at least 6 years old, can't quite get their head around such concepts as tying their shoelaces or that finger paint goes on the page and on the walls. In other words, like a simpleton or a nincompoop. But you must do so in the nicest, most patient, most patronizing way possible. For an example of this technique, let's turn now to Ted Falk's questioning of Paul Champ. Champ was critical of the bill.
These powers have no real limits. The only limits in the Act is that you can't cause death, you can't cause bodily harm, and you can't violate sexual integrity. Everything else short of that, it's up to the imagination of CSIS agents. And it gives a mandate to government officials in all of these departments to basically spy on Canadians. These are going to be government officials who don't have experience in law enforcement or security intelligence. Like, what does a tax auditor know about disrupting terrorism? That's what this bill is doing. It's turning all government employees into spies.
This kid is just not getting it, eh, Ted? I guess you're just gonna have to try it slowly.
Mr. Champ, I'd like to just direct a few questions towards you. Would you agree that Canada has experienced a terrorist act?
Paul Champ is a litigation lawyer with a focus on human rights, employment, labor, and public interest law. Paul has acted as counsel in several important constitutional law cases dealing with fundamental human rights, and has developed a practice in national security law. Now let's hear that question again.
Would you agree that Canada has experienced a terrorist act?
Well, the question would be ridiculous to ask anyone in Canada not living under a rock. To ask it of a man with the qualifications I just listed, well, it hurts my brain. Thankfully, Mr. Champ responds in kind.
Would you agree that Canada has experienced a terrorist act?
That Canada has experienced a terrorist act?
Yes.
In the sense of someone trying to violently overthrow our government or commit a violent act to cause fear? Yes. This is just my view, but I think Champ was so taken aback by the stupidity of the question he had to make sure they were discussing the same thing. However, Falk isn't finished wasting ours and Champ's time quite yet.
And do you think it is the responsibility of the government to ensure that its citizens are safe from terrorism as much as it is possible to do so?
Seriously, is the idea that if the witness says your bill is crappy, as an MP you should respond by asking a crappy question?
And do you think it is the responsibility of the government to ensure that its citizens are safe from terrorism as much as it is possible to do so?
Yes, of course. It's a laudable objective and a primary objective of government to ensure the security of Canadians.
Isn't this fun? If you have any friends who voted Conservative in the last election, be sure to thank them for this. Another strategy is the plain, old-fashioned ruse of questioning the patriotic loyalty of those who disapprove of your bill. I call it old-fashioned because this trick was made popular by a fun guy named Joe McCarthy all the way back in the 1960s, and it has been a Conservative trick ever since. See, back then if you didn't support McCarthy in his hunt against communists, then, well, the argument went, you must be a communist, or at least a communist sympathizer. Fast forward 60 years.
The purpose of the Act is sharing for national security threats. So it makes me wonder if your organization is a national security threat. I see your organization as protesting pipelines, forestry projects, but I didn't hear anything to indicate to me that you were planning to bomb any of Canadian infrastructure or sabotage electrical grids. So I wonder if you consider yourself to be a national security threat, and if you understand the definition, that it won't apply to you as long as you don't commit any of these terrorist activities.
That's LeVar Payne, ladies and gentlemen. You're against this terrorism bill, and this bill couldn't possibly be flawed, so you're a terrorist. However, if you are going to ask a loaded question to a witness based on your misconstruction of their testimony, as LeVar just did, you do take a risk that said witness may make you look petty or stupid. This happened to the Honorable Diana Blonsey during the study, when she decided to use parliamentary privilege to essentially spew libel at a Muslim.
The question I have for you, though, and this will not surprise you, but as you know, there's a continuing series of allegations about your organization and its ties to your American counterpart. And why does this matter? Because it matters, as you know again.
See that smile? She's smiling because she's going to try to ruin the reputation of an organization that disagrees with her government by equating them with terrorists. And, thanks to parliamentary privilege, she doesn't have to prove any of it. Also, this will not surprise you really means, seriously, we both know I think your organization is full of scumbags, but you're here, so let's do this.
Because your American counterpart has often supported radical views and publicly endorsed Islamist terrorist groups, including Hamas. Some of these allegations, I'm sure you're familiar with many more. But
so the charge here is that an American Muslim group, that this Canadian Muslim group is affiliated with, has radical views and supports Hamas. Last time I checked, although I don't check all of Harper's legislation, thought crimes were not yet illegal, and you actually had to be caught supporting terrorists to be labeled a terrorist supporter. A charge which the National Council of Canadian Muslims has never been found guilty of. In fact, none of her allegations have ever been proven. Ever.
So I think it's fair to give you an opportunity to address these troubling allegations because in order to work together, there needs to be a satisfaction that, you know, this can't be a half-hearted battle against terrorism, and where do you stand in light of these allegations?
First of all, fair? You premised your question to an invited panelist by saying they were in bed with terrorists. How is that fair? I'm done with her. I can't believe she was a minister. Mr. Gardy, let her have it.
The premise of your question is false and is entirely based on innuendo and misinformation. The NCCM is an independent and non-profit grassroots Canadian Muslim civil liberties and advocacy organization. These are precisely the types of slanderous statements that have resulted in litigation that is currently ongoing. The NCCM, as you know, is currently suing the Prime Minister's office for defamation because of false statements made against our organization on the basis of innuendo and misinformation. And we have every confidence that the outcome will be favorable to the NCCM. Furthermore, the NCCM is not going to submit to a litmus test of loyalty used against Canadian Muslims and their institutions.
This is what happens when you sling imaginary mud against smart, rational people. You make them look noble and make yourself look like a bigot. Her government colleague, Roxanne James, also likes asking loaded questions of witnesses she does not agree with. But she adapts a technique to avoid the kind of embarrassment suffered by Mrs. Blonsey. See if you can spot it.
Well, there was a comment made by Mr. Champ in his opening remarks. I would think that you surely do not believe that terrorist financing should be allowed here in Canada. But now I'd like to just pass my time over to Mr. Falk. I'm sorry if I've taken up most of your time.
By passing the rest of her time to her colleague, Ms. James doesn't have to risk being called out for the offensive, ridiculous question by the witness. This isn't the only trick this cowardly lioness has developed to combat the scourge of reality-based testimony. This is Stephen Anderson, of the group Protect Our Privacy, and the Guinness World Record holder for the most generic name ever, criticizing the bill.
To help ensure the majority of Canadians are heard, I have brought with me a petition right here of over 100,000 people against this bill. Support of C-51 is plummeting, as we see from recent polls, because the more Canadians know about C-51, the less they like it. C-51 is reckless, dangerous, and ineffective both in terms of content and process. The bill is deeply flawed and must not be made law.
Mr. Anderson had agreed to split his time with Canadian Civil Liberties Association Representative Sukanya Pillay. This was not the first such arrangement. Since the government gets more witness slots to fill than the opposition, many of the real experts had to split their time with other experts. While people who started their testimony like this...
It will be obvious enough that I'm not a lawyer. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Calgary.
We're given 10 minutes. If you claim you're not a lawyer, you should at least have something better to back up your credibility than political scientists at the University of Calgary, the neoliberal capital of Canadian academia. Shit, that's like saying you're an expert of freedom of the press because you worked at Pravda during the Cold War. Anyway, apparently Ms. James has had quite enough of the criticism from Mr. Anderson and decides to take it out on his colleague.
Thank you, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues now.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, Mr. Clerk, honourable committee members, I am grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Yes, Ms. James.
How much more time is left in the 10 minutes?
First of all, that is not a point of order. Second, she knows exactly how much time is left. She just wanted to let the actual legal expert know she didn't want to hear what she had to say. You see, kids, if you're an MP and you feel a witness may have something mean to say, it is better not to let them say it at all.